Hello, my name is Kari Barclay. I use they, them, or he, him pronouns. I'm an assistant professor here in the theater department.
So my name is KJ Sarankowski, and my pronouns are he, him, or they, them, and I'm an assistant professor of comparative American studies and gender, sexuality, and feminist studies here at Oberlin. What is asexuality? Well, I guess I like to answer that by saying asexuality itself is a spectrum.
So one can experience all sorts of attractions, be they aesthetic, be they romantic, platonic, sensual. There are all sorts of ways to be attracted to somebody. The quick definition of asexuality is it's the lack of sexual attraction to others.
So people who might identify as asexual might not be seeking sexual relationships, or they might be seeking sexual relationships only in particular circumstances and don't necessarily identify with the idea that everybody's sort of going out there trying to find somebody to partner up with and engage in a sexual relationship with.
Asexuality gives us language to talk about feeling as if not desiring sexually or not experiencing like one desires as much as society says one should desire. So some language around asexuality, there are terms including demisexual, which describes the experience of maybe being able to experience sexual attraction after forming a emotional bond.
You might hear gray asexual or gray A, which are people who sometimes feel more asexual than other times. The word allosexual has also come up as a kind of counterpoint to asexual, so people who do experience sexual attraction and who might not necessarily identify on the asexual spectrum or under the asexual umbrella, you might hear that word, allosexual.
There's also related terms of being aromantic, not experiencing romantic attraction to others, and gray romantic, experiencing some romantic attraction but perhaps less than other folks in society.
We get this idea of having a sexual orientation or having a romantic orientation as being different ways to think about how we form relationships in the world, and that sort of emerges out of this language of asexuality.
I'm Lauren. I'm a first year, and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Gray. I use he, they pronouns. I'm a second year studying East Asian studies with a concentration in Japan.
I'm Salem. I use they, them pronouns.
So my name is Claudia. I use she, her pronouns. I graduated class of 2020, so directly into the pandemic.
Oh, wow, yeah.
I've got like the spectrum of queer identity, I feel like. I've got a non-binary, and then I'm biromantic, and I'm demisexual.
I identify as demisexual and homoromantic.
I am asexual and heteroromantic.
I am asexual, and I'm gay, and I'm ace. There you go.
So the way I define demisexual for myself is just that I have to experience a personal connection with someone before I feel sexually attracted to them.
I was first full asexual, actually sex repulsed. So anything remotely sexual made me like physically uncomfortable and often like nauseous. And I met my current partner and I found out that I'm actually demisexual. I just need to find the right person. Demisexuality is you need intense romantic connection before you even feel like an ounce of sexual attraction.
I have to either be very platonically close with someone or I have to be romantically interested in them before I even feel like wanting to have sex.
I'm asexual in the sense that like I don't experience sexual attraction. More specifically, I identify more with the term agiosexual, which means in the abstract concept, sex is like okay and chill and like even cool, but like in actuality, I would rather shit in my hands and clap. In junior year, I was talking to one of my friends and she was talking about like this hookup that she had with this one guy, and I was like, oh my gosh, I could never imagine myself like having sex with someone I know or like someone that I'm not that close with. And they were like, you might be demisexual. And then like I thought about it and then I was like, wait, I'm just ace.
I figured out that I was probably asexual in high school at some point. And I kind of had like an awkward time going back and forth with it, where I like discovered asexuality, was like, oh, that fits, but also kind of didn't understand it as well as I thought I did. So then I sort of retconned that for a while and was like, oh no, I was wrong, I'm not ace. And then later, as I grew to understand more of like how you can be romantically attracted to people without the sexual attraction, I was like, okay, maybe I was right the first time actually. And probably by late high school, early college, I was like, okay, yeah, definitely ace.
I kind of only realized it once I got to college, the first time I had sex was my senior year of high school, and it was with a partner who I liked a lot. But I started actually thinking about it once I got to college, and I met other people who were on the A spectrum, because when I was in high school, the only A-spec person I knew was fully sex repulsed asexual. So I was like, okay, I guess that's what being asexual is. And then I came here to Oberlin, where everyone is queer of some kind.
We love Oberlin for that.
And so I started thinking more about my sexuality, and I guess I realized I haven't experienced, people will talk about celebrity crushes. I don't really get those. I call myself A-spec, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah.
I've been researching asexuality since I started graduate school in 2007, so that's been over 15 years of research, and so I've seen the discourse on asexuality shift and grow significantly over those 16 years. I was particularly interested in it in a moment around 2004, 2005, when it was sort of reaching the mainstream. People who identified as asexual were going on television talk shows, talking about their asexuality, and trying to educate the general public that asexuality is a thing that actually exists and is real, and it's okay to be, like that it's a legitimate sexual orientation. And that was kind of where things started, right? Was to say, this is a legitimate experience that people have, and there's nothing wrong with them. It's not something to be treated or cured. And it's funny because we're still sort of in that discursive moment 16 years later, 15 or 20 years later almost, since people first started talking about it in the public realm. But what I've found more interesting, and where I've kind of been going with my research, is to also think about how asexuality helps us understand the organization of our society, how we think about relationship, thinking about something like compulsory sexuality, which is the idea that it's normal, natural, this is all normal, natural, healthy, part of sort of human nature to want to have sex. And so that people who don't want to have sex, there must be something wrong with them, right? So this idea that a person is compelled toward sexual desire or sexuality or sex, and if that compulsion is refused, then they're sort of disrupting that normative order. If that's a disruption, right, rather than sort of positioning it as a pathology, as a symptom, as something to be cured or treated, what if we think about that as just another way of experiencing the world? So expanding asexuality to not just an identity, but a lens through which we can see the world, right? And help us think differently about how we form intimacy, how we connect to pleasure, how we think about relationships, how we think about relationships with others, but also relationships to ourselves, relationships to the world around us. And I have a book called Asexuality, Feminist and Queer Perspectives that tries to really expand our thinking through feminist and queer modes of analysis. It's a collection of essays in an edited volume, and we have a second edition coming out next year. I'm still writing about how to think about asexual intimacies. I think asexuality really lets us be expansive in how we understand love and intimacy and care and relationality.
So I began doing work around asexuality because I identify as being on the spectrum myself. As a theater artist, I've been interested in doing directing and kind of trying to direct somebody else's show about asexuality. What should happen? But I looked and found very little out there. So I ended up writing my own play that was called Can I Hold You? I created this piece in 2018 after a year of conversations and discussions with folks on the asexual spectrum in the San Francisco Bay Area. I kind of heard from folks, what are you interested in seeing represented? What are you interested in seeing on stage? And then ended up writing essentially a romantic comedy about asexual experience that we did first at Stanford University and then in San Francisco at this amazing art space called the San Francisco Mime Troupe. This was one of the first plays about asexuality done in the US, and we had an amazing response. People came back 3 or 4 times, bringing back friends and family because they wanted to show people around them, this is who I am, this is my experience. And then after that, I've been just kind of interested in continuing to explore the theatrical community around asexuality. I started putting together kind of a group of playwrights who are all doing work around asexual experience, kind of setting up some Zoom meetings from us to all talk about asexuality. And then just kind of on a personal note, within my scholarship, I'm kind of starting a new project researching asexuality or kind of aspects of asexuality in culture beyond the specific identification around asexuality. I think about what I call asing culture, cultural work that makes our world more asexual, or acts of performance that make our culture more asexual in certain ways. And it's not about saying that sex is bad, absolutely not. It's questioning whether desire is always innate or whether desire might be more implicated in kind of broader social forces.
Big misconceptions about asexuality, I would say. The idea that asexuality is some kind of symptom, which is to say that it's something that needs to be treated. Asexuality doesn't necessarily need to be treated, it's how people identify.
I feel like people don't recognize how much of a spectrum it is. Sometimes I like to joke that I'm a really great example in that sort of thing, is I've shifted, very much fluctuated over time. I feel like people often think of it just as an absence of sexuality when in reality it's such a spectrum.
A lot of people don't understand that split attraction can be a thing. So like I was saying, I do like girls romantically.
One of the misconceptions is like an immaturity thing or like being a late bloomer. Like sometimes you just don't want to, and that's okay.
People think that like, oh, if you're ace, you're just not into people at all ever. And that is true for some people. There are a lot of, aro ace people.
Something I definitely thought for a while was that people who are asexual do not have any interest in sex, or like don't have sex, which is, I think, not true.
The idea that asexuality is exclusively connected to trauma experience is a false one.
I feel like people are like, oh, asexuals are prude, and it's not like that at all.
It is also possible to both be into people and like have an active dating life.
The idea that like you have to have sex with someone in order to love them, and that you can't have like love without sex. Because like if the opposite is true, where you can have sex without love, you can obviously have love without sex.
Experiencing sexual attraction is not really necessary for having sex. Having sex because it feels like emotionally a way to be close to somebody, and not necessarily like just an orgasm.
People are told that they just need to experience sex or good sex to realize that they're not actually asexual because they need to grow into it somehow. That's another false conception of asexuality.
I think the biggest misconception around asexuality is that it is a matter of behavior rather than a matter of orientation. Sometimes folks think that asexuality is the choice to be celibate or the choice not to have sex. And there's certainly an element of choice in terms of I'm going to choose to take on a label of asexual, I'm going to choose to form community to be able to identify in this way. But asexuality, most people describe it as something that they feel more deeply of. I just noticed something different about myself from how kind of other folks in society might feel. People will kind of create a link between asexuality and being an incel, which are very different matters, right? Being an incel being a question of behavior and saying, oh, I think society is pitted against me for some reason, versus saying, well, I just think I don't feel attraction in the way that others do. The first place I would start if you're looking for resources to understand the asexual spectrum is the Asexual Visibility and Education Network, which is an online space that both has a great glossary, definitions of terms, just kind of really accessible FAQs and stuff around asexuality in general.
That's kind of the classic resource with message boards, FAQ, frequently asked question sites, lots of information on there. I've heard from my students, I'm not on Tumblr, but Tumblr is apparently like the place to go for ace discourse, find out more information about that.
Talk to asexual people. We have an Aro Ace Club, so they meet on Fridays.
Yeah,
so,
Oasis, right?
Yeah, Oasis.
There's a great anthology called Asexualities, Feminist and Queer Perspectives by one of our Oberlin faculty members, KJ Sarankowski.
The Asexualities book is coming out in a new edition, and the people who are being published in that book are writing their own books and articles, and there's just a wealth of information. And to that I will add, there's a newer research database that's been created by some folks working out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, called the Ace Aro Bibliography, and I think it's just acearobiblio.com, and you can go in there and you can search their database and find any kind of like public websites, publications, research papers, anything like that on asexuality or aromanticism. Really excellent resource.
Life is crazy, and you can experiment, see what you like.
Think about it. Really, really think about it. Like, I had a lot of trouble, especially examining my relationship to sex as someone who was brought up in, like, Southern Baptist purity culture, where theoretically what they want is an asexual woman, but in actuality they don't.
Yeah.
But that's a whole different dissertation I could get into.
The point of the language of asexuality is not necessarily to kind of create this enclosed space. This is what asexuality is. I think it's actually more about creating language that people can use to describe themselves.
I guess just like don't feel too much pressure to like put a label on it. If aspec feels right, then it feels right. That's how I kind of feel about most labels.
Put yourself in the scenarios that you think people would want to be in, or the things that like would make other people be like, oh my gosh, I totally want to do that.
If you want it to be a big deal, it can be. If you want that to be an important part of your identity, it can be. It definitely is for me, but it doesn't have to be, and I think that's kind of a key.
Think if it's useful for you, be it either in describing identity, in describing politics. You can use the term asexual in ways that can feel useful for you and don't feel constricted of, oh, if I have this label, it's going to tie me down forever.
If you're like, oh no, I don't know if this applies to me or if it doesn't, like, that's okay.
Yeah.
You don't need to rush that process.
Understand that it's okay not to be normal. Like, being ace is like divergent from the norm, and that's completely okay. It's chill. Don't worry about how other people are going to perceive you.
It's a process and it might change. Sexuality is fluid, so just as I would argue all sexuality is a spectrum, asexuality is also a spectrum, and it's also fluid, and you might move along different parts of that spectrum and off of it at different points in your life, and that's okay. It's for you to figure out, and it's for you to name, and nobody else gets to tell you whether or not you're ace, or if you're the right kind of asexual. That's for you to decide and explore and learn and discover yourself.
And, you know, if someone's gonna fight you about it, like, then maybe they should find other things to do.
Asexual people are valid and they are queer. I've had so many people be like, straight asexual people don't count. They do! I used to be straight asexual. I was still queer. The fact that I've changed doesn't make me any less queer or more queer.
Practice good consent. Don't assume anything about anyone based on their labels, because that's not really the point of them.
The term asexual was most popularized in the early 2000s with the arrival of the internet, but one can find moments of asexuality or asexual resonances throughout history, so it's not a new internet identity, as some people would like to kind of describe it. We can look back at historical figures. Some people, for example, say Queen Elizabeth I or Isaac Newton. Even Kinsey, the famous sexologist, on his Kinsey scale that people often used to talk about bisexuality. Kinsey had a term X, which kind of described folks who don't feel sexual attraction to anyone. And so you can look back at all these moments in history and say, oh, they're kind of little articulations of asexuality, even if people didn't have language or aren't using the same language that we have right now.
A message for the allosexuals out there is like, you also don't need to make a big deal if someone is ace or not. I did run into an issue one time at Oberlin in like a GSFS class where we were like talking about asexuality and there were maybe some misconceptions and people were getting really heated about like, oh, like, well, if this person isn't comfortable with like seeing like sex stuff and like nude bodies at Pride, then that's homophobic. Maybe there's some people out there who are homophobic and ace, but that's really not a core part of the identity and never will be.
Yeah.
Ace people are cool. We're chilling, we're vibing. We do a lot of stuff. Some ace people are like me, where like they make way too many sex jokes because it's funny. And then there are other ace people who like just don't really talk about it or just don't engage with sex at all. So there's a spectrum. People are out there. You'll find your people, I believe.